Good afternoon, everybody. Dobry dien. My name is Karl Stoltz, and welcome to this chat of the American Center Moscow Online. Thank you for joining today. I hope you have joined because you are either interested already in George R.R. Martin and what he's written, or you want to learn more about it. I'll try to give you as much of the second part as I can. If you're already an expert in Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire and what George Martin has written, then you can ask me questions and we can get into debate about trivia from the stories if you like as well. And if you've never had a time to watch the TV series Game of Thrones or read Martin's books, but you're interested in the topic, I'll try to make it generic enough also so everyone is welcome. So again, thank you for joining. Today we're talking about American authors as part of a series. I am doing George R.R. Martin, who is still alive and probably not yet considered one of America's most famous authors like Hemingway or Thoreau or Edgar Allan Poe or Mark Twain, but I would argue that maybe in a few years he will be. So if we can go to the second slide, the one that begins "Winter is Coming." If we look at where we are right now in the world, some might think that George R.R. Martin's stories are coming true suddenly. We have a global plague. It doesn't turn people into zombies, but it does create a lot of devastation around the world, much like both the plague and the invasion from the north that Martin depicted in his famous books. We also have conflict in many parts of the world. We have uprisings, troubling uprisings in cities in America. We have conflict rising among nations. We have economic turmoil. We don't have dragons, fortunately, but we have a lot of other factors going on that might make you think that we are living through a real life version of Game of Thrones right now with winter coming, although it is supposed to be summer coming now. And I don't know, depending on, it's been rainy this last week in Moscow, but I think summer is probably going to arrive before winter, although some days I'm not sure. Robert, if we play the first clip, this is a preview of the HBO series Game of Thrones, which is based on Martin's books, and it will give you a bit of a flavor of what to expect.
I, Eddard, of the House Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, sentence you to die.
I saw what I saw. I saw in White Walkers.
You understand why I did it?
He was a deserter.
The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword.
Is it true he saw the White Walkers?
The madman sees what he sees.
Lord Eddard Stark, I would name you the Hand of the King.
I have no choice.
That's what you tell your family. Tell yourselves. That's what men always say when honor calls. You do have a choice, and you've made it.
You might not have my name. You have my blood.
Bastard boy with nothing to inherit. Off to serve in the ancient order of the Night's Watch.
Next time I see you, you'll be all in black.
It was always my colour.
You were never afraid.
There's nothing to be afraid of. You've chosen your opponents wisely.
I have a knack for it.
The Targaryen girl convinces her horse lord husband to invade. We won't be able to stop them.
Get it over with. Cats have throats.
We commit murder on the word of this man.
I'm a purveyor of beauty and discretion. All desires are valid.
Jury.
To a man with a full purse.
We've come to a dangerous place. I was trained to kill my enemies.
As was I.
Everybody knew what this place was. No one told me.
Well, Lord Snow, it appears you're the least useless person here.
Perhaps I was wrong to distrust you.
Distrusting me was the wisest thing you've done since you climbed off your horse. You think it's honor that's keeping the peace? It's fear. Fear and blood.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. That was the preview for the first the first series of Game of Thrones on HBO, the American home box office. And you could see from that a little bit of everything. Maybe it brought back memories if you've seen it before. The characters were still very young. But it revealed that the show was going to have a lot of medieval themes. It was also going to have some violence, some sword fights, a little bit of R-rated material, sex, nudity, and a lot of good character dialogue. And I think that's what made it one of the most popular television shows in American history. And the audience built every year as the series went on to its conclusion last year, because the show grabbed people and kept them there. It was a sort of a soap opera with swords. Next slide. One of the tricks that made Game of Thrones so popular that George R.R. Martin used in his writing was giving different perspectives from different characters. If you've read any of the novels, A Song of Ice and Fire, the first novel was called Game of Thrones. So the television show took the name of the first novel, Game of Thrones, rather than the entire A Song of Ice and Fire. But if you read A Song of Ice and Fire, what Martin does is he tells the story through the eyes of different characters. Each chapter is one character's perspective on events, and then the next chapter is from another character, sometimes seeing the same event from different directions. This makes it very interesting to read. It reminds me a little bit of reading some great Russian literature, sort of the perspective from the character, like in Crime and Punishment, or the compelling story of many different families and interlocked relationships, like in Tolstoy or Pasternak or others. So a lot of these literary talents that Martin used to make the story also played in the television show, although you did not see the TV show from only one character's perspective. But the storyline technique was very much popular, and the interaction between characters. Martin had a lot of influences on writing these books, but one of them was the stories of the rivalries between the different houses, the different kings and queens of both France and England in the Middle Ages, and how the families would plot to create the downfall of the other so their house would rise to power. He based a lot on historical fact. He used a little bit of Shakespeare too, to have the sort of dialogue between rivals to the throne. We're going to watch another example here. This is an interaction in the first season between Cersei, the wife of the king at that time, and one of the leaders of the House Lannister, and Ned Stark, who was the hero of the first series, the leader of the House Stark, who's been called to serve the king. So let's watch this little preview from season 1 and listen to the dialogue between the characters.
You're in pain.
I've had worse, my lady.
Perhaps it's time to go home. The South doesn't seem to agree with you.
I know the truth John Arryn died for.
Do you, Lord Stark? Is that why you called me here, to pose me riddles?
Has he done this before?
Jaime would have killed him. My brother's worth 1,000 of your friend.
Your brother? Or your lover?
Targaryens wed brothers and sisters for 300 years to keep bloodlines pure. Jaime and I are more than brother and sister. We shared a womb. Came into this world together, we belong together.
My son saw you with him.
Do you love your children?
With all my heart.
No more than I love mine.
And they're all Jamie's.
Thank the gods. In the rare event that Rob believes us whores for long enough to stumble drunk into my bed, I finish him off in other ways. In the morning, he doesn't remember.
You've always hated him.
Hated him? I worshipped him. Every girl in the Seven Kingdoms dreamed of him, but he was mine by oath. And when I finally saw him on our wedding day in the Sept of Baelor, lean and fierce and black-bearded, it was the happiest moment of my life. And that night he crawled on top of me, stinking of wine, and did what he did, what little he could do. And whispered in my ear, Lyanna. Your sister was a corpse and I was a living girl, and he loved her more than me.
When the king returns from his hunt, I'll tell him the truth. You must be gone by then. You and your children. I will not have their blood on my hands. Go as far away as you can, with as many men as you can. Because wherever you go, Robert's wrath will follow you.
And what of my wrath, Lord Stark? You should have taken the realm for yourself. Jaime told me about the day King's Landing fell. He was sitting in the Iron Throne and you made him give it up. All you needed to do was climb the steps yourself. Such a sad mistake.
I've made many mistakes in my life. But that wasn't one of them.
Oh, but it was. When you play the Game of Thrones, you win, or you die. There is no middle ground.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that little clip from the first season with a very famous quote in it. When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. There is no middle ground, which shows the level of competition between the different houses and characters. Next slide, please. And also some very, very good acting and dialogue there. I hope you enjoyed. Game of Thrones has many, many characters. It's kind of hard to remember them all. It reminds me in that regard of Anna Karenina or War and Peace. You kind of need a map to remember who is related to who. But there's a indication from one of the early seasons of just all of the characters that George R.R. Martin introduced over time from various houses, some of them married to each other, some of them bitter enemies of each other, all overlapping. And it makes it hard to follow at some points, but he had a talent for writing by giving the perspective of each character and making sure each character was very well developed, that people did not have as hard a time following that many characters as they would if they were all just introduced at the same time. He also, he does what, as I mentioned, his writing is called point of view writing style. He takes each chapter through the eyes of one character. In the first book, that was 9 characters. Eddard Stark, Ned Stark, the leader of that clan, and some of his children and his wife, and then a few other characters. By the current book, he's had 57 characters who have had points of view or the chapter of their own or a preview chapter of their own in one of the books. So he's telling the story from many different points of view, some of them who have very different perspectives. But one of the techniques he uses, which has shocked a lot of people, both on the television show and in his books, is he kills off characters quite often. Sometimes by surprise, including a few cases, the character that had the point of view chapter dies at the end of it. One of the reasons he said is if he kills off characters, then you pay more attention to the ones that are left. You don't get lost with so many in the plot, but also it makes you feel like you're in the body of the character he's narrating. If you know that any minute you could die, it makes the book much more intense and easy, keeps you there and makes you want to read more to find out what happens to each person. But he has no problem killing off quite a lot of the characters in his book, including the heroes. I'm not going to do spoilers and tell you who lives and who dies now, but there are very few characters by the end of the book that haven't either died or been threatened with death at least once during the series. Okay, next slide. So I'd like to talk a little bit now about George R.R. Martin himself, the author, what his background was, and what inspired him to write this famous series of books. His real name is George Raymond Richard Martin. The R.R. stands for Raymond and Richard. That reminds people of famous author of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, J.R.R. Tolkien. They both have two R's in there. In George Martin's case, his born name was George Richard Martin. He received the name Raymond when he was confirmed into the Catholic Church, and he's always gone by all four names. He was born September 20th, 1948, in the town of Bayonne, New Jersey. You can see a picture of a street of Bayonne back in the late 1940s. Bayonne is a port city. You can see the picture below. It's one of the port cities for New York City. All the ships that come to New York City dock at various cities nearby, and Bayonne is one of them. But Bayonne was a very poor city. Most of the families living there were lower middle class. George R.R. Martin's father, Raymond, who everyone called Smokey, was a longshoreman, which means his job was taking cargo off the ships. It was a very physical labor job. It did not pay that well. And George and his family lived in very poor housing. His mother did not work. Most women back then did not. But her family was wealthy from the past. They lost all their money in the Great Depression. But George used to talk about walking by his old family home that his mother would point out, and the dock that their family used to use and own. But by the time George was young, they were living in special housing projects, which were housing built by the government for low-income people that had lower cost rent, but were very small and poor quality. As a result, George Martin didn't have a chance to travel. He dreamed, because he could see all these boats sailing past his house, his town. He'd look at the flags of the different boats and try to dream of one day sailing to those countries. He'd try to learn about those countries. He read a lot. He was a very avid reader. You can see him there at a very young age reading. In addition to reading a lot of traditional literature, he loved comic books. And his special treat once or twice a year is his father would get on public transportation and take him to New York City. They would go to see the Thanksgiving parade at Macy's, or to see Santa Claus at Christmas time. And they'd usually buy him one toy. But he did not grow up with a lot of money. And he attended the same school all the way through 8th grade, a school that he had to walk many blocks to get to every day. But he spent most of his childhood reading and doing his schoolwork. And he said he was not a very good student. He next slide, please. He did all his classes and got okay grades. But the one thing, and this is rather ironic, the one thing he never could get a good grade in was a foreign language. He tried Latin and French, and did not succeed in either one, which is ironic because in his books, especially in the Game of Thrones series, there's a lot of use of foreign languages, but it was not coming from George R.R. Martin. He was not like Tolkien, who invented his own languages and spoke about 20. Tolkien is pictured there on the far right with the pipe. Next to him with a pipe is William Shakespeare. Both were very big influences on Martin and his writing, but he said the biggest influence on him was Stan Lee, who is the other person pictured there, and he was the creator of the Marvel Comics with characters like Spider-Man and the Avengers. And George Martin bought every comic he could obtain. He would go to, when he was a teenager, he would go to comic book conventions. In fact, the first Comic-Con, which was a international comic book convention. The first time they ever held a convention was in New York City, and the person who bought the first ticket to that convention was George R.R. Martin. He was the first in line, the first to attend. So he was a huge fan of comic books. He also was a big fan of chess, Shachmati. He played chess on his high school team all 4 years, and he became captain of the team. And he continued his interest in chess all his life. And if you think about that line by Cersei in the Game of Thrones, you win or you die, that's kind of like a game of chess. Martin began to write his own comic book superhero stories, and he started to write for magazines for comic book fans called fanzines, and write to other fans of comic books. That's how he probably got interested in fantasy and science fiction literature. Okay, then Martin went to university, to Northwestern University in Chicago, Illinois. He was accepted at several universities, but his interest was journalism, and Northwestern had a very good reputation as a university for teaching writing and journalism. And he wanted to see some other part of the world besides New Jersey and New York City. So he got on a bus, a Greyhound bus with 3 suitcases and an old typewriter, and he went to university. First time he'd ever been outside of the New York, New Jersey area in his life. He rode a bus to college. And he stayed there for 5 years at university. He earned a bachelor's degree, baccalaureate in journalism in 1970. And then he also got a master's in journalism in 1971. He started actually writing and making some money. There's a good question there about his graduation cap. Thank you, Alina. Yes, he was maybe not a hippie. You can see his hair wasn't very long then. But he was what they call a conscientious objector. At that time during the Vietnam War, America had a national draft. If you were a male, you had to join the military and serve for several years as a soldier, often in Vietnam. He objected on the grounds that he opposes war. And that's also a little ironic when you think about all the war and fighting that you read about in his books, including the Game of Thrones series. But he said that he wrote about war in those books to show how horrible it is and the pain it causes and the long suffering even after the war, rather than to glorify it. So he's always tried to present war as a very evil thing. And he personally was very opposed to war and got permission, because probably he was a university student. He certainly didn't have a rich father to help him. He got permission, instead of joining the military, to do a voluntary community service. So he joined VISTA. Next slide. He joined VISTA, which is the Volunteers in Service to America, which was a NGO that let people do community service instead of military service. And for 2 years, he worked in the Chicago area, Cook County Legal Assistance Association, helping poor people getting legal advice. And that was his job. And there's a picture of him at that time. From his hair length, he looks a little more like a hippie there. And then he started to grow his beard, which he's kept ever since, in the mid-1970s. There's a picture there of George Martin in the center, looking off to the right. And to his left is Kit Harington, who played Jon Snow in the Game of Thrones series. They look a little similar, I think. I don't know if Kit Harington was cast because he looked like George R.R. Martin at the time, but that is a very interesting resemblance, even the glasses. Martin, after Vista, he kept trying to sell his stories. He had sold one successful story to a science fiction magazine. He had a few relationships with girlfriends. He married one called Gail Bernick in 1975. He wrote his first successful novel in 1976 called The Dying of the Light. And it was a very interesting story. It was about a planet where the sun is slowly getting further away and dying. And all the people know that soon they will lose their sunlight and their heat and then their lives. And people were very sort of accepting of this, but also very depressed. And it was an interesting approach to a story, and you could see some of the similar themes later in Game of Thrones with the idea that winter is coming and, you know, we're all going to suffer. He spent a lot of time in these years doing chess. He was director of the Continental Chess Association, ran major chess tournaments. This was right after Bobby Fischer defeated Boris Spassky in Reykjavik, and it made chess very popular in America. So suddenly there was a lot of public participation and interest, even television, of chess tournaments. And Martin was very busy with this, but then eventually chess became less popular in America again, and Martin knew he had to get a better job. He also wrote some stories in these years that were a combination of science fiction and horror, which had not really been done before, but he wrote one called Sand Kings and one called Night Flyers, which took the science fiction themes, but instead of sort of good guys and aliens, he threw in horror elements, which later appeared in movies like Aliens and many other science fiction movies that have come out since Martin started doing this. He met at a science fiction convention a person called George Guthridge, who was an English professor at a small college in Iowa called Clark College, and he helped Martin get a teaching job there. So for the rest of the 1970s, Martin was teaching English journalism and also still writing. He wrote two of his stories then, one called The Storms of Windhaven and one called And Seven Times Never Kill a Man. And he was beginning to get a reputation, next slide please, beginning to get a reputation as a successful science fiction author, but only for a small element in science fiction. He didn't really have a huge name among the genre, but he attended almost every convention he could. He loved going to conventions ever since he was a child. Comic book conventions, science fiction conventions, game conventions, other writing conventions. And at these gatherings, he met a lot of other writers, including some very famous ones who I'm sure influenced him. He was writing a lot of stories for magazines. He helped organize some of the conventions. He, in 1979, after 3 years in Iowa, which has very, very cold winters, so some of his Winter is Coming themes might have been prompted by very cold, snowy winters in Iowa. His wife decided she could not stand the winter anymore and wanted to move away, and they decided to move to New Mexico, which they had passed through once on the way to a convention and enjoyed. That's a picture of Santa Fe, New Mexico, where they moved. Much warmer. He really liked the lifestyle there. His wife went first while he was finishing his teaching job, and by the time he joined, he had grown apart from his wife, and they divorced. And although the wife was the one who wanted to move, she went back, ironically, to Minnesota and cold winters, and he stayed in Santa Fe on his own. And he made it his home and started writing full time and trying to get people to buy his books. Next slide, please. After a few years of writing in Santa Fe, he either got bored or decided he needed more money, and he agreed. He also said that one year, 1983, he completely lost. He did nothing because he was running a role-playing game called Super World, where everyone pretends to be a superhero from the comics, and he was the person in charge of the game, and he basically said he wasted an entire year. And then when he ran out of money, he realized he had to get a job again. So he took a job in Hollywood. While he was doing this, he was also writing a series of books called the Wild Card books, which are still around. It's many different authors who each write a chapter about a particular character, and then Martin edited them all into one storyline. So if you see that chapter by chapter approach to writing the Game of Thrones series, he probably learned that from the Wild Card books. But they were set after World War II, when an alien virus has given certain people superpowers and how they interact with other people. So if you see an X-Men theme there, I think you're probably right. In 1984, he wrote a book called The Armageddon Rag, which was a disaster. It sold very poorly. It caused his publisher to stop wanting to take his writings, and it made him think about giving up. So then he went to Hollywood, and he got a job with CBS Network in 1986. The first shows he worked on were The Twilight Zone, a remake of the old science fiction series. He wrote scripts for them, and then he got a job with a TV show called Beauty and the Beast, where you see a picture there. This was not the cartoon by Disney or the modern version or the classic. It was a television show in the 1980s. He also worked briefly on Max Headroom, which was a very innovative show using cyber technology to create characters. And he worked on some movies. Night Flyers, which was one of his books, turned into a movie. The Armageddon Rag was even turned into a very unsuccessful movie. So an unsuccessful book became an unsuccessful movie. The girl pictured on the bottom left is Paris McBride, who he met at a science fiction convention and persuaded her to come live with him in Santa Fe. And she did for over 20 years. They finally got married in 2011. But they were partners for 20 years before then, and they still are. We're going to show a clip of Martin's TV show that he was the executive producer of, Beauty and the Beast. So you can see something besides Game of Thrones that Martin was responsible for.
This is where the wealthy and the powerful rule. It is her world, a world apart from mine. Her name is Catherine. From the moment I saw her, she captured my heart with her beauty, her warmth, and her courage. I knew then, as I know now, she would change my life forever.
He comes from a secret place, far below the city streets, hiding his face from strangers, safe from hate and harm. He brought me there to save my life. And now, wherever I go, he is with me in spirit. For we have a bond stronger than friendship or love. And although we cannot be together, we will never, ever be apart.
Okay, so that was Beauty and the Beast, as written and produced by George R.R. Martin. The show lasted only a few years. And by 1991, Martin was getting very frustrated with Hollywood. A lot of the scripts that he wrote never got turned into TV shows or movies, or others where he spent a lot of time writing a script. It got cut because of cost, or they didn't have the special effects he wanted, or the time limits. They would cut his work down, and he just got very tired of not having a chance to really express himself. So he went back to Santa Fe, and he thought about what to do next in his life, and he decided he was going to take on J.R.R. Tolkien. So next slide. J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, was famous and already globally very popular for his Lord of the Rings series and The Hobbit before that, in which he created an entire mythical world and populated it with both humans and strange creatures, elves and dwarves and orcs and other things. And it was very well known. And Martin had, of course, read his books as a child and reread them many times and enjoyed them. But he said he didn't like Tolkien because it was a good guy story where it was pretty clear from every character whether they were good or evil. And you kind of knew in the end that good would win, even if it was going to be challenging. And he wanted to write a story where you couldn't tell whether the characters were good or evil, and you couldn't tell who was going to win, or if anyone would. He also said that he was very heavily influenced in writing A Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones series, by a series of books by French authors. You see several of them there: The Iron King, The Strangled King, The Poisoned Crown, and The Royals. They were set in 13th and 14th century France, and they were about the conflict between French princes and noble houses at that time. So it was historical fiction, but with a little bit of a fantasy element, and he found those to be very, very influential. He also read a lot of historical fiction. There's a series there by Philippa Gregory about the wives of Henry VIII, but Martin has always been a voracious reader, and he read everything he could about the history. He did not speak any language except English, so he spent more time reading about the history of England than any other country. And a lot of the elements in the Game of Thrones series are from what he read about history, especially the War of the Roses and some of the succession battles in England in the Middle Ages. And then he also said that Tad Williams was a big influence with a book called The Dragonbone Chair. If you look at the picture of that chair, it looks a little bit like the Iron Throne, although that was made of dragon bones. But all in all, he said the author that most influenced the way he wrote A Song of Ice and Fire was Stan Lee. And in particular, he said the Avengers series. So if anyone has seen the recent films about the Avengers, the idea of people who have very different backgrounds coming together to fight, but not exactly always getting along with each other, that was a huge influence, that and all the other comic books that Martin read. So he decided to write a modern version of Tolkien's novels with more sort of the ugly side of war and violence, with less sanitized text, so he could refer to sex, and his characters could curse with words that would not have been allowed at the time that Tolkien was writing his books because there was censorship. But in modern era, Martin let his characters say what people would say in a fantasy medieval world, perhaps, without any censorship or trying to avoid topics like that. So he took on all those topics and he started writing his first song, or his first novel. Christina asked me what was the best movie for me. If you're referring to the Game of Thrones series, we'll talk about those now. If we talk about the movies that George R.R. Martin produced, I have to say I did not see most of them. They weren't very successful. The one I did see was the Beauty and the Beast TV series, which was okay. It wasn't fantastic, but it certainly had an interesting storyline. All right, so next slide. And we're going to start off with the first novel, which was called A Game of Thrones. And because his first novel was called that and the television series was called that, now most people refer to the entire set of novels as A Game of Thrones, whereas he means the series is A Song of Ice and Fire, and only the first novel is Game of Thrones. You see there the famous Iron Throne built with all the swords of the defeated lords when the Targaryens took over the continent where he set it. By the way, Martin said that he did not do like Tolkien. Tolkien devised maps and histories for all of his lands and even languages before he started writing. Martin doesn't do that. Martin had a basic idea in mind, sketched out a few maps and family trees, but did not develop languages, did not develop a history, but develops as he writes, which is one of the reasons he's very sensitive about checking everything to make sure they're accurate and he doesn't forget something later and change a character's hair color by mistake. But also, he doesn't really want to share his notes in his creative process because the novels aren't finished yet, and he's still deciding, in some cases, exactly what happened historically or where something is located. So a lot of it's still very vague because it's vague to him too. So the first novel, which kicked it off in 1996, sold well, but not amazingly. But it certainly created a very highly popular television series. And let's watch one clip from that now, which is, I'm sorry, no, we're not going to watch a clip now. We're going to go on to the next slide. So the next slide and the next novel that came out was called A Clash of Kings. He wrote it in 1998, 2 years after he wrote A Game of Thrones. And that novel developed the plot that was set in motion in Game of Thrones, where a king that was ruling suddenly dies. And then there are a lot of people fighting over the throne, some of whom think they have a legitimate claim for it, some of whom are just power hungry, some who want revenge on people who they think took the throne away from them before. So you have a lot of people from a lot of houses all competing to take power over the land. And there pictured, you see just about everyone who thought they had a claim to be king of the island of Westeros, where most of the story is set. And I'm going to test my ability to remember all these characters. In the upper left corner, you have Euron Greyjoy of the Iron Islands, sort of a pirate king. Then you have, can't tell. I thought that was Melisandre, the priestess, but I'm thinking now it is not. Maybe someone can help me in the comments. The third character there is Jon Snow. We'll talk about him later. Cersei, the wife of the king who just died, who certainly thinks she should be in power. Sansa Stark, who is the daughter of Ned Stark and inherits the North when others pass away. Jaime Lannister, I'm sorry, not Jaime, that's Joffrey, the Joffrey Baratheon, the person who became the king when his father died. Mace Raider, who is a leader of the wildlings in the far north, who thinks he should be king of all the lands. Balon Greyjoy, who is the king of the Iron Islands at the beginning of the series. Robb Stark, who is the son of Ned Stark, who also thinks he should be the king after Ned goes. Marjorie Tyrell, who is an ambitious young woman who marries one of the Lannister boys and becomes queen and tries to take over the kingdom. Daenerys Targaryen, the blonde, who believes that she is the rightful ruler of the kingdom because her father was killed and she is the legal inheritor. Stannis Baratheon, who thinks he should take over because he's the oldest brother of the dead king. I think the next character is the wife of Robb Stark. Then we have Tommen Baratheon, the youngest son of King Robert Baratheon. We have Renly Baratheon, who is the younger brother of the king who died. That next picture at the bottom left corner is the king who died. Bran Stark, who is a son of Ned Stark and is crippled. Then we have a picture of the old king who did die, the Targaryen who ruled and prompted the beginning of the storyline. Then we have Yara Greyjoy, who is not the same name in the book, but she is the daughter of the Greyjoy clan. And then finally you have the Night King, the evil leader of the White Walker zombies. I will answer Alina's question about my top 3 fantasy books in a minute. But first, I'd like to move on to the next slide. So Game of Thrones came out in 96, Clash of Kings in 98, and 2 years later in 2000, George Martin published what he thought would be his final book in the series called A Storm of Swords. The book was so long and he found it so hard to cut any characters or storyline that it actually came out in a 2-book set. It was too big to bind into one book. So he was already going a little bit beyond his plans. In this 2-book series, a lot of the conflicts that he set up in the other books turned into major battles or major scenes. But at the same time he was having big epic battles, other characters in other locations were having personal struggles, which made them just as interesting. Alina asks, what are my top 3 fantasy books? I'm hoping that I can answer that with a series of books rather than one particular title, but A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin is definitely in my top 3. I'm also a very big fan of J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings series. My favorite of that series would have to be The Two Towers, the second one. And then for a third one, I don't know if it's fantasy or science fiction, but Picnic by the Side of the Road, a Russian novel I really enjoyed. I also liked Mui by Zamyatin, but that's more utopian science fiction. For other authors, I would probably say A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin, which talks about magic and dragons in some islands where there were limitations. And that's one of the things about Martin's books too. There's limitations on power. There's magic involved, but it's not all powerful. People also have to win with their own swords or their own brains or their own luck, and they don't just go around throwing spells all the time. Of course, the Harry Potter books are very good too, but I think that I like the sort of gritty realism of Martin's books and others I read more. And then the other question from Mikhail about my favorite character in the Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones series. That is a really good question. I hadn't thought about that before, but I'd have to say I have three. One of them is Arya Stark. One of them is because of the way she develops as a character. And we don't, of course, know in the books what will happen to her. We know in the films. Jaime Lannister, who I think is fascinating because he goes from being a very selfish villain to actually a very open-minded, almost hero in the course of the books and in the film. And the third character is one that doesn't really appear at all in the film, but is primarily in the books. And that is a character who comes back with another pretender to the throne called Young Griff, kind of like the times of troubles in Russia with a false Dmitri, brings back a pretender to the throne. And there's a lot in the books about his storyline. And Mikhail also says he just finished watching the series a month ago and wants to know what is my feeling about the end. Someone also asked for no spoilers, and I'm going to respect that. We'll talk a little bit about the end, but with no spoilers shortly. Okay, so we're now on A Feast for Crows, which took Martin 4 years to write, and again continued the storyline, and proved to be popular. And I have a clip, but I'm not going to risk showing it, I think. So the next book was A Dance with Dragons. After Storm of Swords and Feast of Crows, the next book was A Dance with Dragons. And it came out in 2011. 2011 was a 6-year gap between books. And this was becoming a trend for Martin. He was having a hard time managing both the popularity, because by now the television show had come out and people were watching it and asking that. He was having a trouble helping advise the script, doing all of his other things, still attending all of his comic and science fiction conventions, and finding quiet time to write. And as it increasingly went on, he put writing aside. He's a slow writer. He doesn't churn out books all the time. He does a lot of research, and then he needs to sit down in his home in Santa Fe and have hours of peace. And then he writes various notes or one character's storyline, sometimes multiple chapters for one character that then he cuts up and puts together. And as the story got more complex and he had less time, he did not produce books as much as the fans who loved reading them or the people writing the television series wanted, because they wanted to know what happened next. And in some cases, Martin said, I don't know what happens next. So by the end of Dance with Dragons, the storyline in the television series started to go beyond the time that Martin had written. And then he advised them on what he had in mind for the finale, but he didn't give them all the details. So a lot of what you see in the last 2 seasons of the television series Game of Thrones was made up by the script writers for the TV series and not by Martin. And when he does publish his books, maybe we're going to find some interesting things that did not happen in this TV series. There's also many characters in his books that never appear in the series. There are just too many for them to cover, even though they cover a lot. Okay, Tatiana asked about Lisa Tuttle as his co-author. Lisa Tuttle was a girlfriend when he was in Chicago, and the first book that he wrote about the dying son, she was the co-author. They haven't collaborated since because she got married and moved off to England, actually. All right, next slide. Okay, so we're all waiting to see what happens next in his books, because he's working allegedly on a book called The Winds of Winter, which he started writing in 2012, and now we're in 2020. It's not finished yet, and he has a dream of spring, as we all do, but he has a dream of that being the final book, but he hasn't even started writing it. So Martin has a lot of work ahead of him, and the timing of the final books is really a good question. Next slide, please. His series of books has become very, very popular around the world. It has been translated now into 49 languages, not just the television series, but his actual books. And it is available in Russian as well, if you haven't already had a chance to read it. In Russian, it's called Igra Prestolov, or at least the first book is. But you can see there that there are books in French, Arabic, German, Spanish, Chinese, and many, many other languages, which shows you how incredibly popular Martin has become. And if, Robert, if you want to take a chance on one more clip, the last one. This is the Game of Thrones television show theme, but set on a interesting map of Europe. I hope you'll enjoy it. It's from a different source. It's not a clip from the show, so it might work. Okay, so I hope that gave you an example of how Game of Thrones has gone global. The theme song, everyone knows, the opening setting with the clockwork models, and then the show that follows. If you haven't had a chance to see the television series before, I recommend you do. It's long, a lot of episodes, but it's perfect watching during quarantine. If you have seen it, but have not read the books, please do. They're very different from the series, with a lot of good literary style. And if you have done neither, choose one, the books or the television show. They're different, but I hope you have a chance to experience George R.R. Martin's writing. Martin is not young, and he's not very light weight, so we don't know how much longer we will have the benefit of his writing, but I would encourage you to pray that he is able to finish the 2 books so we all know what happens in his world, and to continue to read good writing by authors from around the world. But I think that for contemporary American authors who have had an influence globally, whether it's high quality or not, I think George R.R. Martin has to rank up there as one of the most current day influential American authors. So thank you for your attention. Spasiba и добрый вечер. And summer is coming.